one of the things that I want to talk about, because we kind of talked about this in another earlier part of this video, is nutrition and how important that is. And not only on the ride, but leading up to the ride, because that's going to be your fuel source for when you're on the bike. Let's say somebody has no idea about what they need to eat or what they're supposed to do if they're training for a century or one of these 7-day, 500-mile rides that we're talking about with the Empire State Ride. I mean, what would you tell that person if they said, "Hey, Charlie, like, what should I eat?"
Well, yeah.
Because I'm sure you get those questions where you're like, "Oh, there's a lot to this."
There's a lot to that. There's a lot to that. But, trying to condense all of that, down to it is that you have to eat a certain amount of macronutrients that is equal to the amount of work that you're doing. So if you're riding for 1 hour, what you're going to eat and drink in that 1 hour is different than on the 4-hour-a-day rides. What you eat and drink on a 1 hour or an hour and a half easy endurance ride is going to be different than what you're going to eat on a hour and a half day where you're doing a bunch of intervals where the intensity is a lot higher. Mm-hmm. And what really the difference is just the amount of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins that you're going to eat for those different types of demands of training. Mm-hmm. And I actually created a chart that I think that eventually we could put up, or it'll be on the Empire State Ride website, that has some real guidelines as to how many grams of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats to eat for a set given, volumes and distances and intensities along the way.
Let me stop you there. Because I know that this is a thing that I see: macronutrients, micronutrients. What do you mean by that, macronutrients?
Macronutrients are essentially the ones that that are important to us is carbohydrates, fats, and protein. Those are the three macronutrients. Micronutrients are more kind of like all the enzymes and like all the real nutrition that's in the macronutrients. For example, carbohydrates. If you're eating whole wheat or pasta, let's just say regular white pasta, it's the same amount of macronutrients that maybe whole wheat pasta or brown rice or potato can give. But all those other foods give you a lot more micronutrients in there that are really good for your health. So what you want in the end is to eat really good, nutritious carbohydrates. So the macronutrient that has a lot of really good micronutrients in it.
Okay.
But the macronutrients, the chart that I'm talking about only speaks of those macronutrients.
Okay. As far as the day before, because I know it's a question that people say, you hear about like carb loading, and there's probably a lot of different myths on that. I mean, what do you recommend to somebody? Let's say in this particular example, they have a 100-mile ride the next day. What kind of preparation are you doing nutrition-wise the days before?
Well, you said the right word there, because it's days before. It's not the day before. And so, if you're going to do a 100-mile ride, the week before the ride, it should be, or maybe even 10 days before the ride, again, depending on your goals, should be a taper week. So in that taper week, as you get towards your event or the day before, you're going to make sure that you're loading with carbohydrates according to how you're training, because you don't really need to carbo load a huge amount on those days leading to it, as long as you're eating the right amount of macronutrients for the amount of exercise that you're doing. Because at the end of the day, if you're doing that, your glycogen stores, which is what you're achieving by eating carbohydrates, are going to be filled all the time. So, if you train the Monday, let's say you're going to do a century on Sunday, Monday you rest. Well, if you eat, the right amount of carbohydrates, proteins, and nitrates at that, your carbohydrate stores are going to be pretty full on Monday. And then on Tuesday, you're going to eat a little more because you're going to train on Tuesday. And then on Tuesday, you're going to fill it up a little more. So a little bit at a time, so you're never in a big deficit. You never want to be in a big deficit. And then the day before, it's always good to load a little bit. Again, depending on your goals, because, you know, if you eat like, you know, an amount of carbohydrates, like a big carbo load meal, and you're not used to doing that the night before, the next day, your legs are going to feel like, you know, big blocks of wood for the first hour or two. You know, you're going to have so much water, and so, you know, they're just going to be like filled with like, and that can be snappy. And so, if you really want to have, you know, if you want to ride in the front group and you really want to go, you know, you can't afford to, like, you know, take it easy on the first hour or two and get all that water out of you, and you know, starting to feel, you know, like you have some, you know, snap in your legs and not just like, you know, big blocks of wood. So carbo loading is, you know, it's a process of, you know, every day you're basically carbo loading. If you're training for endurance, you're always carbo loading. You
Okay.
know?
I know that you've called it something as far as training the gut. Is that really what you're describing right now? Or is that something a little bit different? Like if somebody's maybe heard that before, how would you describe that? And why is that so important for a cyclist?
Yeah, in a sense, you know, the process that I just talked about is training the gut, because if you are following the the recommendations for carbohydrates on that chart, you're going to be eating a lot of carbohydrates when you get to those 4 and 5 hour days. And a lot of those carbohydrates, you're going to have to eat them while you're riding. And so that if you follow that, you're going to train yourself to eat, you know, and to process a lot of food while you're riding. If you don't do that, you're going to get to, you know, the Empire State Ride or any multi-day ride, and you're going to, you know, you're going to try to eat like a lot, because the next day you got to go another 90 miles and you're going to eat more than you normally do. And chances are that you're going to have some digestive problems, because you haven't trained your gut to process that many carbohydrates and that many sugars while you're exercising. And secondly, you don't really know what works for you because you haven't experimented. Some people do really good with, you know, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Some people do well with gels. Some people don't do well with gels, and some people don't do well with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. So part of training the gut is also learning, you know, what foods actually works best for you, and so that you can ride at a, you know, at a decent intensity and eat at the same time and have everything go through and digest and provide, you know, the energy that the food is meant to provide. And so training the gut's a big deal, because once your gut shuts down, you know, it's like no matter what you put into it, it's like it's just you're gonna be bloated, and it's just not gonna go through. It's almost worse than not eating. You know, you're gonna bonk because the food is not actually getting digested, but it's sitting in your stomach, creating, you know, major discomfort. You know, so training the guts, it's important, but it's not difficult to do. All it takes is, you know, follow the recommended guidelines for eating certain amount of grams of carbohydrates while you're training, and that's a super simple thing to do. And then the only thing you have to do is figure out which form of carbohydrates works for you. So you might start with, you know, trying some bars, you know, from your local bike shop, and if that doesn't work, you can switch bars, and you can try some gels, you know, different combinations.
Okay.
But it's important to go through that.
I'd like to ask you about when you're getting on the bike, right? And this is kind of a continuation of nutrition. What are you doing, and what do you recommend for hydration? Let's say somebody's got an 80-mile day, it's hot out. I know at least on the Empire State Ride, you had some days that got up there in mileage, but lots of hills. So you're really pushing yourself in some pretty warm, sticky days at times. What's your recommendation to people if they're not really sure how to hydrate their body properly?
Yeah, that's important, because hydration is actually more important than nutrition. There was a CTS coach once came up with this saying that I thought was brilliant. It says, nutrition doesn't work if you're not hydrated. In other words, you can eat all you want, and if you don't drink, your performance is gonna go down. And not only that, but then you're not going to be able to really break down the food and digest. So nutrition only works in a hydrated state. So hydration may be like the first point. It's like as soon as you get on your bike, start drinking. That guideline that I was telling you about, that chart, also has the hydration in there as well. How many bottles you should drink based on, distances and things like that. But generally speaking, you want to drink, let's say a 2-hour ride, not like incredibly hot, just normal summer day, not like blistering hot. A bottle an hour probably will be okay, and of those 2 bottles, one would be water and one would be a hydration mix that has some electrolytes in it. That's kind of a typically, sound, program to do for nutrition, for hydration. On days where you're going to be out there for 4 or 5 hours and it's blistering hot, you basically got to just be drinking all the time. It's like you could, a bottle and a half per hour would be better.
I know you've explained this before, and I forget exactly what happens, but I remember you explaining, like, if you don't get the proper hydration, essentially it's something happening like in your stomach where your nutrients aren't being absorbed anymore or something.
Yeah, not only that, but that's the first thing that's going to happen if when you get dehydrated is that your muscles just stop working. All of a sudden you're going along the road at let's say 13 miles an hour, and that's a perceived rate of exertion of maybe 6 to 7 on a scale of 1 to 10, and all of a sudden it feels like an 8 or 9, on a scale of 1 to 10. And also now you're going 10 miles an hour. That's not a fitness problem usually, especially, if you're trained and you're, a couple hours into the ride, or 3 hours or 4 hours into the ride. If you lose I think it's 3% of your, I have to look at the actual numbers. I can't remember, but if you lose 3% of your body weight from water loss, your performance is going to go down, by a large percentage, and your day is really going to be a lot harder. So hydration is critically important. Really.
Now, I know that we've gotten questions because we've done some like Facebook Lives where people will kind of ask their questions live on the broadcast, and we'll link to that too in this description of this video, all these other resources that we keep mentioning. Some people ask about like electrolyte, pills or things that you can put in your water. Do you have any kind of recommendation or opinion on that stuff? Or?
Yeah, I do. I have an opinion about, hydration, or what you put in your bottle for hydration should just answer the hydration question. Should have maybe a little bit of sugar in there, a little bit of carbohydrates, but generally hydration drinks should be mostly about hydration. So they'd be high in electrolytes and not very high in carbohydrates. And your carbohydrates and the main amount of your carbohydrates should come from food. And in the past, and there's still some products out there that kind of combine both, that have a lot of carbohydrates, a lot of sugar, and a lot of electrolytes. But it seems that the general public has a hard time processing that type of drink that has everything in it. Some people can do it, and if you can do it, it's really convenient, because then all you have to do is drink. But generally, I would say the majority of people that I know of can't really do that, including myself. So, there's a lot of companies out there now that are making exercise hydration products that are primarily a hydration vehicle, not a carbohydrate, not a calorie. They're not high in calories.
Okay.
So that's what I would say. Yeah, definitely go with that type of hydration product.